Morgan McSweeney may have resigned, but Labour Together, the shady organisation he founded and which made Keir Starmer Prime Minister, is still making headlines. Last weekend, the Sunday Times reported the organisation had paid a PR firm to smear two Sunday Times journalists. Gabriel Pogrund and Harry York appeared in a 58-page report written up by the shady US-based PR firm APCO, and the report was commissioned by the then head of Labour Together, Josh Simons, who wanted to discredit the Times reporting on Labour Together failing to declare £700,000 worth of funding. The report, written by this reputation management company, had, without evidence, claimed that the reporting in the Sunday Times was based on Russian hacks, and it went into particularly personal details about Pogrund, referencing his Jewish faith and saying of his previous reporting on the royal family that it, quote, could be seen as destabilising to the UK and also in the interests of Russia's strategic foreign policy objectives. So they were basically calling him a Russian dupe. This set off a whispering campaign in Westminster. Then on Friday, there was another splash, this time in The Guardian, who have uncovered evidence that Josh Simons pressed UK intelligence to try and investigate the journalists causing problems for his organisations. So Simons, who is now a minister in Keir Starmer's government, had asked the spy agency to investigate Paul Holden. He's the investigative journalist who had provided the Sunday Times with the original evidence Labour Together had hidden key donations. He's also author of the brilliant book, The Fraud, Keir Starmer, Morgan McSweeney and the Crisis of British Democracy, which was released in November last year. And he joins me now. Paul, thank you so much for joining me in the studio. Hold up your book.
All right, here you go.
It's been a big...
My publicist will be very angry if I don't get it in shop properly. You can see I've got spatial awareness problems right here.
I think it might be flipping you.
Yeah, this is why I keep on getting lost whenever I come to the studio.
There is a full interview specifically on this book with Ash Sarkar for Downstream, which is brilliant. So we're not going to cover sort of all the chapters in the book. We're going to talk about this particular drama, this particular outrage, I suppose, in terms of you being investigated by this firm hired by Labour Together. I suppose, first of all, just tell me how your week's been.
It's been very intense. It's been a slightly odd experience because, I write a bit about in the book about we knew that they were doing something. We knew that there was some sort of dirty tricks afoot, but we didn't know the full extent of it, exactly where they went, who they hired to do it. And so this week has been this very odd experience of finding out sometimes quite upsetting material, like quite shocking material about these people probing into my private life in a pretty ugly way. It's also very odd to have other people write about you and have these documents that show up you don't even know you're featuring in these stories. So it's been a bit surreal. I would say just before we move on, one thing I should say is that, we're very lucky on the story because, they tried all these dirty tricks stuff back in February 2024, and we didn't quite realize the extent of it. And I was very lucky. I had a very good friend of mine called Khadija Sharif, who's from South Africa, and she's an investigative journalist, absolutely brilliant. And she's basically the person who's broken the story open up wide. And we were very lucky because she was able to come to us, and she couldn't tell us everything, and there were issues around sources, but she was able to tell us some stuff back in sort of late 2024. After the last election. So we knew something was happening. It wasn't entirely surprised, but this stuff it's been really shocking.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get into the specifics of what we've learned this week. I suppose I want to start by taking a step by step. If someone's watching this, they're like, what the hell is going on?
Right.
Let's do this chronologically.
Sure.
And as far as I can tell, it all begins with an article published in 2023 in the Sunday Times. So this is the article, you can see it on screen here, about how Morgan McSweeney failed to declare over £700,000 of donations to Labour Together. Now, that article was written by Gabriel Pogrund and Harry York, the Sunday Times journalists. But at the bottom of that article, it said that some of the sources, some of the evidence had been provided by you, Paul. So before getting into this investigation into you, what was in that article in 2023 in the Sunday Times, and why did it upset Labour Together and Morgan McSweeney and Josh Simons quite so much?
Well, So the key period in the sort of the money story is 2017 to 2020. That's a period of time in which Morgan McSweeney is the company secretary of Labour Together, and during which time they failed to report £730,000 in donations. They're investigated by the Electoral Commission in September 2021, and they're found guilty. And they're basically given a slap on the wrist, said, it's £14,000, and please do better next time. And in the public domain, Labour Together say, this is just as an error to the Ministry of Oversight. Basically, we forgot to report these donations. Now, that money is really that money is absolutely vital to understanding what's happened over the last decade of our British politics. Because, on the one hand, what it's being this pot of money is being used for two things. One is to basically wage this undeclared war against the Labour Party itself from inside. Often, it gets independent journalists, which is another sort of quite disturbing part of the story, is how much there's this distaste for journalism in this political project. And the second thing is it's getting Keir Starmer elected leader of the Labour Party. It's paying for polling, which then allows Morgan McSweeney to confect a very well-curated leadership pitch of Keir Starmer. So to give you an example, at the last 6 weeks of 2019, while all Labour activists are going around the country and knocking on the doors, trying to get the Labour Party elected into government, according to Rachel Wearmouth, Morgan McSweeney is spending all of her 6 weeks while employed with Labour Together working on Keir Starmer's leadership campaign. Right. But the documents that I gave to Gabriel show is, at the very least, it seems to suggest that there was maybe a decision not to report donations. That actually this wasn't some sort of big error, but that it was strategically useful for them not to report donations because it basically meant they weren't scrutinized. Nobody knew that this tiny, very boring seeming think tank was taking in so much money. And the documents were basically saying, well, actually, it looks, well, two things. One, maybe they didn't report donations, but also even more importantly, or equally importantly, that when they were put under investigation by the Electoral Commission, there was a plan in place to maybe not tell the Electoral Commission the full truth of what happened in order to get the slap on the wrist. So It's like a double whammy in effect.
Yeah. And so I suppose why this really matters, to take a step back, at risk of repeating lots of what you discussed with Ash Sarkar, but we'll sort of, I suppose, to summarise it, Labour Together puts itself forward as this sort of happy, clappy, fluffy organisation which is trying to end factionalism in the Labour Party, led by Morgan McSweeney. In fact, what it's doing is trying to lay the ground to completely expel Corbynism from the Labour Party, to retake it for the right. And they were, in fact, getting donations from two very rich men, and one of them, Trevor Chin, with very close ties to Israel. And if that had been discovered, that would have blown their cover. Yeah. Because if you say we're this nice, happy, clappy, let's end all factionalisms, and also, by the way, we're being bankrolled by this hedge fund manager and this very pro-Israel businessman, that the story doesn't stand up. So the assumption I've always had is that they made a conscious decision to say, okay, we won't declare it. Again, this is an assumption. We know that probably we're breaking the rules, but it's better to just accept the fine down the line than have our cover blown while it really matters before the leadership election.
Exactly. And also, I think the timing of the Sunday Times article is quite important, because obviously November 2023, basically the polling is showing the Labour Party is going to win the next election. Like, this is, and if Labour Party wins the next election, Morgan McSweeney at that time is the head of strategy for the election campaign. He's effectively deciding what's going to go into the manifesto. It's pretty much widely accepted that if the Labour Party wins, he's going to have a very senior, very prominent role in Keir Starmer's prime ministership, which he does, because he becomes the chief of staff. He's very important in choosing people. But at the same time, Labour Together is actually itself playing a very important role, because it goes dormant between 2020 and 2023, basically. And it's reawakened under Josh Simons, who comes in as the new leader. And there's loads of money that comes in, some of from the same donors who gave money back to them in 2017 and 2020, but some other big millionaire donors as well. And at that stage, what Labour Together is doing two things. One, it's basically incubating all the policies that this particular section of funders wants to see the Labour Party introduce, but it's also incubating a large number of the MPs who are going to be elected as the new Labour intake. So between January 2024 and July 2024, Labour Together ends up funding the election campaigns of a huge number of the intake of Labour MPs, including, for example, Imogen Walker, who is Morgan McSweeney's wife. Labour Together is helping to pay for her election campaign. So the story is hugely damaging to this political project because, one, it says Morgan McSweeney, there's dirty money here. He's got, he may not be an appropriate person to be taking power, but also this organization Labour Together, which has effectively been chosen as a vehicle to prepare for government and are starting to fund people's run into government and had already published Rachel Reeves's first paper, that sort of stuff, is now also linked to these allegations. So it's absolutely damning for this political project. And you could see behind the scenes the way they've hired APCO and what they set out to do is they understand that this is a bit of an emergency. The story is actually really damaging and go to really bad places for this incoming leadership.
Yeah, that's really helpful, actually, laying out those two phases. So the initial phase of Labour Together, I suppose, is it 2016 that it's founded?
2017 to 2020.
2017 to 2020, where what they're trying to do is pave the way for Starmer to defeat a Corbynite candidate and then, expunge any kind of left-wing identity from the Labour Party. Then it goes dormant because, of course, Morgan McSweeney is now Chief of Staff to Keir Starmer. But then presumably there's a decision that they need to work on sort of building organisational muscle before they go into government, as you say, picking supportive MPs, which involves quite a lot of fixing, one would imagine, along the way. And that's precisely when your story started coming out, which they saw as reputationally damaging. So they wanted to kill this, and they went to quite extraordinary lengths to do so.
They did. And there's also, so in addition to that story coming out, the timeline's quite interesting because effectively Gabriel Pogren's story comes out. And then on the same day is the first day we announce in the public that we are putting out, that I'm writing this book. So my publisher puts up a blurb of the book, and it's very clear that my book is going to be an examination of Labour Together, Morgan McSweeney, dirty tricks, all the ways in which they came to power. And the following day, I then publish one of a series of articles I'm writing with Matt Taibbi in the United States. He's a pretty fearsome American journalist. And that was looking at the second part of what Labour Together was doing between 2017 and 2020 with its undeclared money, which was setting up this thing called the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, which is a bit of a complicated story, so I'm not going to go into it here. But effectively, that is also very damaging because what my reporting was showing is I had these internal documents from the Labour Party showing that Labour Together, while it wasn't declaring donations, was playing a very direct role in setting this thing up. And that organisation had become, had done very problematic things in the UK, going after individual independent journalists here, demonetizing left-wing media outlets, but had gone to the United States and become incredibly prominent and extremely controversial. And basically, by the end of 2023, hated by the American right wing, absolutely loathed by it. So it's not just, it's in addition to the money, it's also revealing that Morgan McSweeney is very closely linked to this project that is anathema to a potentially incoming Trump administration in America as well. So it's very damaging for them. And
it's important to bring that up as well, actually, because that is sort of what Labour Together was doing between 2017 and 2020. It was doing all of this polling of the Labour membership. So they were laying the groundwork for a leadership election where they'd have a right-wing candidate who pretended they were soft left, which was Keir Starmer. Right. And also they knew that to retake the party, they needed Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party to get defeated very thoroughly in a general election. So unlike 2017, and what you document is that they play a very active role in seeding stories, which, to my view, sort of wildly exaggerate the extent of an anti-Semitism crisis, quote unquote, in the Labour Party.
Yeah, and I think in addition to which they are doing this campaign called Stop Funding Fake News, which is very closely linked to Morgan McSweeney, which is a genuinely despicable campaign where Morgan McSweeney and Imran Ahmed, with the endorsement of Steve Reed, pretend to be a bunch of grassroots activists. It's classic. It's a classic disinformation campaign where they say, we are grassroots activists. We care about, what we're worried about is hate and lies and misinformation. Therefore, please demonetize these left-wing outlets. These left-wing outlets, which are independently regulated, have editorial codes and good, editorial codes of good practice, and are reporting accurate stories that are uncomfortable for McSweeney's political project.
So they go off, it was like the Canary and Squawk box,
and Evolve Politics and Squawk Box. But then the reason it becomes so ugly and complicated is that this thing sort of mutates, this project mutates organically and opportunistically, and starts taking on the American media ecosystem. So I did a story for Dropsite last year, which was huge in America, didn't cross over here at all, where I was basically showing that one of the things that Stop Funding Fake News was doing in between 2019 and 2020, while Morgan McSweeney is still around and still involved in it, is that they were going after big right-wing American websites like Breitbart. Right. Now, I'm no fan of Breitbart, and I don't particularly think their writing is very good, and I wouldn't recommend it to anybody. But by the time I'm writing these stories in 2023, 2024, it's not just this dirty money, which is obviously very important. It's not just they were secretly behind stories that don't stand up. It's not just that they were going after left-wing media. It's also that they had basically declared war on right-wing American media, which is disastrous politically if you actually link those things together. If the story breaks in its fullness, this political project is in real trouble ahead of the election.
Okay, let's get on to APCO. So
APCO, by the way.
APCO, sorry.
Yeah, it's all right.
So it's APCO.
APCO. I don't know what it stands for, I'm afraid, but APCO.
We'll put that in there. We don't have to edit that out. It's okay that I got it wrong. The audience can know.
Believe me, I didn't know their name either at all.
APCO.
Yeah.
So Labour Together see that you're writing this book.
Right.
They see this story in the Sunday Times that they don't like.
Yeah.
They see the stories that you're publishing with Matt Taibbi, which they don't like, Matt Taibbi. And they go to this American public relations firm called APCO to investigate you and journalists at the Sunday Times. I suppose talk about what we should know about APCO. Who are they? What were they hired to do?
Sure. So the APCO is like a massive international, multinational, like reputation management firm, right? So if you're like an oil company or like producing cigarettes, or you're Unilever or something, and you have some problems with your brand, or there might be some negative reporting, you hire APCO and they'll basically help you navigate that crisis situation. They have they're such a huge company, so they have a London branch, which is basically the branch that's brought in to do this work. Previously, APCO's represented people like Elbit Systems, so the Israeli weapons manufacturer. And so it's quite an interesting story because
Elbit Systems, Big Tobacco, and Labour Together. That's their their big clients.
That's their sweet spot, right? So it's an interesting story because actually it was only yesterday for the first time, again, this is weird experience of having all these things come out that you've never seen before, is that Matt Taibbi posted a copy of the contract between Labour Together and APCO, which I've never seen before. And it's just like really damning document. Because after the story breaks in the Sunday Times on Sunday, Josh Simons comes out and he says, I never want to target British journalists, of course, ignoring that I'm British. Even though I'm born in South Africa, I'm actually British. And, we were investigating a hack. So, of course, I appointed APCO. But we've seen this contract now. And this contract is it's really pretty terrifying. Because basically, I don't know if you could put up a picture of it, but basically what it shows is that APCO have been hired specifically to look into the funding and motivations behind their Sunday Times story, and then to specifically look into me and Matt Taibbi, because me and Matt Taibbi plan to publish more articles, and because I'm publishing a book. And I think the final line is something along the lines of, you have it on screen, so I hope I don't misquote
I'm just going to read it out, actually, because
it.
I'd seen the reporting of it in The Guardian, but it's only now that you've told me that the actual
thing that's interesting is
that
the narratives that were proactively undermined, I think, are so telling.
Well, let me read it. So it says, Dear Mr. Simons, so that's Josh Simons, we are pleased that you have selected APCO Worldwide Limited to provide the following scope of work during the term. That's the term of the contract. So APCO will devise a concise strategy to aid Labour Together. APCO will investigate the sourcing, funding and origins of a Sunday Times article about Labour Together, as well as upcoming works by authors Paul Holden and Matt Taibbi, to establish who and what are behind the coordinated attacks on Labour Together. The approach should provide a body of evidence that could be packaged up for use in the media in order to create narratives that would proactively undermine any future attacks on Labour Together. The material can also inform any future legal strategy that Labour Together might wish to pursue against any of these parties. And it says the work will include open source investigation, so OSINT, recovery and preservation of evidence, human intelligence investigation, recovery and preservation of evidence, financial investigations, digital forensic investigations, stakeholder outreach, media packaging, and dissemination. So the dissemination part, there's been lots of talk about Gabriel Pogren, that there's sort of whispering campaigns. Yeah. So even if you don't produce concrete evidence of anything, you can say, well, actually, these guys are a bit fishy. Exactly.
And that's sort of what they do. I mean, first of all, the thing that always strike me about their contract is there's no mention of a hack, of course. It is clearly about developing a response, a narrative response that can be given to the media to deal with the stories. I also think it's interesting that they call it a coordinated attack on Labour Together. It's like, this isn't attack, it's public interest reporting about potentially serious wrongdoing. Like, if the theory is correct that Morgan McSweeney didn't report those donations, that's a criminal offense, right? That's fraud, right? And for me, coming from South Africa, I've done lots of corruption work, anti-corruption work in South Africa, understanding how dangerous it is to be in a position where you have powerful figures like Morgan McSweeney, who at the very least don't have respect for law, have clearly broken the law because they didn't report donations, and may even have done worse than that. Coming into positions of power is extremely toxic to like the health of your democratic system.
Can we just
deeply problematic.
Just in terms of criminal offence,
right?
So he's been proven to have broken the law.
Absolutely, it's illegal,
and that's why they were fined. Is that the same as I always think of a criminal offence that someone would be investigating him or arrest, or how does that work?
So it's unlawful. He's broken electoral law.
Yeah.
Right. Now the issue there is basically intent. So if it was a mistake and it was a genuine error, he didn't mean to report it, and it slipped his mind. And we can come into the story how it escalates at a certain point when I think we get the document that proves that's very hard to sustain. But if he's done it intentionally, if he's decided I'm not going to report these donations, then that's a specific criminal offence, which is fraud by failing to disclose.
Yeah.
Because there's a legal duty on him created by electoral law to disclose information to the commissioners of the Electoral Commission. There's the specific people he'd have to disclose to. And if he's chosen not to do that, then he's basically committed fraud at that point. Yeah. So this is the seriousness of the allegation, right?
I should probably say he's denied that and he's not being investigated.
I'm not sure if he's denied anything on the record,
okay, fair enough.
Labour Together have said it was a mistake, so that's effectively a denial by proxy, right? Yeah. What is absolutely clear is he's broken the law. There's no doubt about that. There's also no doubt that he's responsible for that because he was the person in Labour Together who was supposed to report donations. Really, the issue is, did he do it on purpose or not? And that's what the stories are basically looking at. Like, does the story hang together that this guy simply forgot? And that's what escalates the story to an even crazier point in February 2024. Because what happens after the Sunday Times article comes out, the Sunday Times article is very strong, but we'd gotten feedback behind the scenes from the lawyers saying that some of the material looked like it might be hearsay, so we needed to corroborate some of it. So what I did was I went to the Electoral Commission, I did an FOI request. And this FOI request, which is strange because FOI requests almost never work, but this one actually strangely did. And the documents they gave me were utterly damning, like really genuinely damning. So I went to the Electoral Commission and I said to them, please can you give me everything, all the correspondence or all records of phone calls between Morgan McSweeney and the Electoral Commission, I think it was between 2017 and 2020. And they sent me back these documents. And what they show is that Morgan McSweeney had called the Electoral Commission in November 2017 and said, I haven't been reporting donations. I don't want to report donations. I don't think that we're a members association legally required to report donations. We're not public facing. So this is the situation. And the person on the phone to him says, that doesn't seem entirely right. Let me get back to you.
Yep.
And writes back to him a month later. And this is another thing that's disclosed. There's this very clear letter that gets sent to Morgan McSweeney where it says, no, we've looked into it. You are a members association. You have to report donations. This is how you report donations. This is the form you use to report donations. Every donation over £7,500 you must report. And then they also, in addition to which, they have an extended period of correspondence over about a month time, in which it's very clear that Morgan McSweeney understands that he has to report donations, right? And that's in addition to the stuff that's in the public domain, which is that they're repeatedly telling people that they're reporting donations. They put on their website, Shabana Mahmood writes an article for Labour List. So the question then becomes, how believable is it that this man, who's supposed to be a chief of staff and an absolutely brilliant strategist and an amazing wonderkind who's changed our politics, has been told he has to report donations when he says he doesn't want to, is also running a secret project which requires misdirection and secrecy to work, is telling people he's reporting donations. Some have forgot to report donations, right? That's the key issue. So when we get that document I get that document in December, and I've been approached by the Telegraph because they've got a lead of their own, which is a very juicy lead. So I start working with the Telegraph on that story. And this is where the timeline gets very interesting, because on the 31st of January, 2024, I published a follow-up article with Matt Taibbi. And in that article, for the first time ever in the public domain, I specifically link Labour Together to the creation of CCDH. Right?
Campaign for Countering Digital Hate.
Centre for Countering Digital Hate, right? Which is obviously very controversial in the United States. It's already been sued by Elon Musk, for example. Again, not that I'm a particular fan of Elon Musk's politics, but it's very controversial. And I've also revealed in those documentation that when CCDH went to the United States and got charitable status, they provided misleading information to the IRS to get charitable status, which is very problematic for the guy who runs CCDH, a guy called Imran Ahmed, who is not only a close friend of Morgan McSweeney's, but according to his own version, is also a very close friend of Josh Simons, who's the director of Labour Together. Then on the 6th of February, the Telegraph sends a right of reply to Labour Together and says, we've got these documents of the Electoral Commission. We're about to run a story that says you didn't report donations. It looks like actually there was a plan not to report donations. You were told repeatedly of a need to report donations. And then things got crazy at that point. And from what we can gather from the timeline is that slightly before then, Josh Simons has gotten this mad report written by some madman in South Africa, this 58-page report, which basically paints me and Gabriel Pogrund and Harry York and Matt Taibbi and my colleague Andrew Weinstein, who I've been working with for 15 years, as part of like a globalist Russian conspiracy. Like totally mad nonsense rubbish, but like just like BS to like the ultimate degree, right? And they've taken that report and they've extracted certain information from it, and they've gone to go complain to the National Cybersecurity Center saying, we think Paul Holden is a threat to democracy because he's been handling Russian hacks, which is totally nonsense, right? As the Guardian's now confirmed today, my sourcing for my stories is internal Labour Party leaks, which if you're a journalist in the UK is like it's like a Tuesday to get leaks from within the Labour Party, right? And then 2 days later, I get an email from Pippa Crayer saying the Guardian's about to run the story that's alleging that you're under investigation by the National Cybercrime Security Center for handling these Russian hacks. And I write back and I say, this is absolutely absurd. What on earth are you talking about?
Because you weren't under investigation. All that had happened is that Josh Simons had sent them an email asking them to put you under investigation.
And the timeline's a bit unclear, but basically the National Cybercrime Security Center said, go away.
Yeah.
Like there's nothing here. And of course, if you look at what they've actually said about me, so now the story that came out today in The Guardian it reproduces what they sent to the National Cybercrime Security Center, which I just saw for the first time as well. And it's mad stuff. It's really silly stuff, right? It's basically, we think that he's connected to journalists who've previously received hacks from Russia. I don't know what they're talking about. And second of all, he lives with his partner, Jessica Murray, who was the daughter of Andrew Murray, who was an advisor to Jeremy Corbyn, which is basically, these people are lefties, therefore they must be suspicious. Please go after them. And I think that's actually been one of the hardest things to deal with is that we now know from the Guardian reporting that one of the things that APCO did was find out where I lived and who I lived with. They used the software called Trace IQ to identify my family. It was extremely personal, an extremely personal attack on like my private life, which is, it's chilling to think that these people who are now in our government effectively were saying, yeah, you should go and use these data gathering tools to find out where this journalist lives and who he lives with, and how we can then use that to confect a complaint to the National Cyber Security Center. It's sort of like a nightmare scenario, really. I mean, it's also this doubly ironic thing because Josh Simons is now in cabinet. One of his briefs is digital ID. You have the minister who's in charge of digital ID, who's employed a company which is using sophisticated data tracking techniques to identify where a journalist lives, so you can report him to security services.
Tell us a bit about Josh Simons, because people will have heard a lot about Morgan McSweeney,
right?
Obviously, one of the biggest sort of figures in British politics. We'll talk in a while about sort of the most recent developments with Morgan McSweeney and Mandelson, but we'll park that for the moment. But let's introduce this character, Josh Simons, who people might know less about. So he's sort of a main character in the story because he's the person who becomes director of Labour Together in 2023, and then who responds to this reporting by sending this attack organisation to go investigate you all. So who is he? What kind of person is Josh Simons?
He's very tall. He's now the MP for Makerfield. So he's been around the Labour Party since, I think it was 2017, 2018. He leaves the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn, and he writes this like pretty stinking letter as he leaves, which then I think is published in either the Independent or the Guardian, basically saying he's leaving because the left wing of the Labour Party are like deeply anti-Semitic. And I think he goes to Harvard at that point and studies some more.
So he's a sort of junior staffer. He's a junior staffer in HQ. Corbyn becomes leader.
Yeah.
Then he
basically leaves,
resigns, and makes a big sort of public thing about it.
But it seems like he has quite close friendships and connections at that time to Morgan McSweeney and Imran Ahmed, at least according to Imran Ahmed's version. And I think Josh Simons has said the same thing. And he goes to Harvard and he studies, and then he's basically brought back at the end of 2022 to become the CEO of Labour Together, to effectively relaunch the organisation as a policy shop for the incoming government, but then also to oversee effectively the distribution of this very substantive amount of money coming into Labour Together and donor funds to the 100 MPs that Morgan McSweeney has basically handpicked to come in.
Including his wife.
Including his wife, right? And Labour Together is funding that, right? So he becomes an incredibly important part, like a really central part of this operation. And of course, June 2024, when the election is called, as far as I can see, maybe I'm wrong, but as far as I can see, Josh Simons has never won an internal Labour Party election in his life. But the NEC selects him, basically parachutes him as the candidate for a safe seat in Makerfield. And it's pretty much understood. He'll get that seat, and then he'll become a very prominent member of this administration very quickly. He then goes in, and he's quite like an aggressive figure, quite bolshy in his like media. He's quite abrasive in his media appearances. He like really upsets the whole of Scotland when he says during one interview, he says, there's a discussion.
Send the asylum seekers up there, doesn't he?
The discussion about asylum seekers. He's like, I don't care about the human rights implications of asylum seekers. I was like, well, first of all, I do care about the human rights of asylum seekers. For all I care, they should send these barges that the asylum seekers want up to the north coast of Scotland for whatever I guess. Of course, it's like a minute to do. But he's the co-founder, or one of the co-founders of this thing called the Labour Growth Group in Parliament. So he's very much part of like a Labour Together network, because I think this is the key thing about Labour Together. And why they're so important. It's not just, obviously Morgan McSweeney is involved in Labour Together, Josh Simons is involved in Labour Together. They're funding 100 MPs, but there's a whole range of people in the cabinet who have long-term associations with Labour Together. I mean, this is effectively a Labour Together government. From 2023 onwards, you have very prominent members of the incoming cabinet who have said, we've been working with Labour Together and Morgan McSweeney for a long time. This is the heart of our political project. And it's Steve Reid, it's Shabana Mahmood, it's Bridget Phillipson, it's Wes Streeting, it's Rachel Reeves. This is the whole cabinet that sits around Keir Starmer is effectively a Labour Together cabinet, right? And this is the problem that this story now has for the Labour government, is that Labour Together is now associated with two quite distinct periods of wrongdoing. One, under Morgan McSweeney, when they weren't reporting donations, right, and doing all this dodgy stuff about journalists. And two, because they're inheriting this mess of the McSweeney years, they're now implicated in this very dodgy stuff where they're hiring, effectively PI firms to go after journalists. So now the second part of the history of Labour Together is tainted with this sort of wrongdoing. And that's very problematic for this government, right? And it's very problematic for anybody associated with the organisation, because now, fairly or unfairly, Labour Together is now associated with these two scandals. And that is absolutely disastrous for Starmer, really is.
Let's talk about, the second phase of controversy. And I suppose really get to the bottom of why you strongly believe, and I mean, lots of people seem to accept, that what APCO did was wrong. Because I suppose, to play devil's advocate, you could say this is an organisation who found themselves under attack. Mm-hmm. Maybe they were genuinely suspicious that this was information that was leaked from a foreign government. And if they did have that suspicion, was it not within their rights to hire someone to pursue that line of inquiry?
I think that is a bit hard to sustain.
Go on, explain
a bit
why.
hard to sustain. Well, first of all, because it's not an attack, right? This idea of like scrutiny as an attack is nonsense, right? None of what was published in the public domain was untrue. None of what was published in the public domain was unfair. Everything that the Sunday Times reported was accurate. Everything that I reported was accurate. Nobody was making up lies about this organization. Nobody was trying to taint this organization, right? Now, this is the thing that I think gets lost in the story. And one of the ironies of the way in which we now know that Josh Simon's framed. He went to the National Cybersecurity Center and said, in order to defend democracy, you must investigate Paul Holden and Matt Taibbi and and look into the origins of the story. But from my perspective, as an anti-corruption person, which is actually my background, is that this is the essence of public interest reporting. I believe, I went to Gabriel Pogren in 2023, and I must say, I think Gabriel Pogren, even though I think we've come at the McSweeney and Corbyn periods from different political angles, like he has genuinely been treated extremely badly in the situation, right? The stuff that APCO seemed to have dug up on him and gone after him is extremely personal. It's utterly despicable, right? So it has to be like completely denounced, no matter like your political position, because it was really genuinely disgusting what they did to him. But what I was trying to do, and I think what we were all trying to do, is very clearly say these people are coming into power. You have to scrutinize them. And you have to scrutinize them because they've broken the law. And people who break the law shouldn't be in power. It's very simple, because if people who break the law get into power, they might break the law again. Or they might do like really messed up stuff like bringing Peter Mandelson back into the center of political power, right? This is the problem. This is what I was trying to do in 2023 and in 2024, too late in my book, because my book came out today, was to blow the whistle and to say, these are people who are lawless and they're reckless. And if you have lawless and reckless people taking over your political government and your establishment, you're in real trouble. Because they do things like bringing Peter Mandelson when everybody and their mother knows that he's got long-term connections to Jeffrey Epstein. And it basically just associates your entire government with scandal, with corruption, with misconduct. It destroys both the capacity of government to function cleanly. It creates perverse incentives because you have people in political power who need institutions not to work anymore in order for them to stay in power. That's the really problematic one. But also creates this like deep well of public distrust, right? Because you have people who are now looking at this disaster of a government that is covered in scandal. Every week there's a new scandal, right? And it's really ugly scandal. It's scandal like this and Peter Mandelson. It's not like...
I suppose to steel man the case, though, because you can say, look, what we published was true.
Right.
And our interest is just in sort of outing the truth and everything being accurate, and therefore no more questions should be asked. But I suppose...
I don't know where Morgan McSweeney lives. I don't know where Josh Simons lives.
What's the relevance of that, sorry?
Because they found out where I lived.
Because they found out where you lived.
Because they went personal. Like, it's not just that they were trying to find out what my political motivations were. And also, I've got to say, I've looked at some of the intelligence reports, the ones that I have seen. These are not accurate reflections, right? These are not accurate reflections on my career and my motivations, because it's very clear if you look at my career. I'm a Safra Center for Ethics fellow, I'm a network fellow at Safra Center for Ethics in Harvard. I've published 6 books up until now. I've given evidence in multiple criminal civil cases leading to massive asset forfeitures, seizures in South Africa. I've worked with law enforcement in the United States. Like, I'm very obviously not the person they paid me to be in these pictures. It's not just that these versions of events are untrue and wrong. They're like patently, obviously, stupidly wrong, right? Anybody who spends 3 seconds Googling me and Googling Gabriel Pogren and Harry York and Matt Taibbi understands that this stuff is nonsense. It's not credible in any way. And that's the key issue for me, is that I was telling the truth. Gabriel Pogren was telling the truth. Harry York was telling the truth. Henry Dyer was telling the truth. Matt Taibbi was telling the truth. And they were telling lies. And the difference is that we were telling truth in the public domain, in the public interest, backing it up with facts, showing our working, being accountable for what we're saying in the public domain. Because if we tell lies about them, we could be sued for libel.
Yeah.
They were telling lies about us, gathering dirty information, and trying to get us basically investigated by security services based on lies. These are not commensurate things. right?
So I suppose this is what I'm trying to get at, is just sort of precisely what is wrong about it. I mean, I'm not here to say they haven't done. I'm convinced they've done wrong, but I just want to pass out where the problem is, because I suppose in terms of, so say for example your book, and I think we should have done more of it at the time, when there were sort of stories about Corbyn's hate factory or sort of stories about Labour anti-Semitism, which were often on paper, like by the letter true. You know, there was a Labour member who had posted this in a Facebook group. There was a Labour member who had said this in one meeting in, Liverpool in 2020. So you could say all of this is completely true, but I think we should have done more of looking into the journalist who wrote the story, what their motives might have been, looking at who was feeding them the stories, which is what you talk about, because Labour Together was feeding them some of these stories. So I suppose, what I'm saying is was the problem the investigation, or was the problem the fact that they didn't do this as a report that you could respond to? They did it as a secret report, which then became the basis of a whispering campaign.
I mean, there are multiple things, right? So the best kind of journalism, which I think we all hope that we do, the best kind of journalism is supposed to hold the powerful to account, right? And the best kind of journalism is putting true facts in the public domain to hold the powerful to account, so the public can also make up their mind. And it's perfectly appropriate. It's part of media literacy to be like, let's understand these people's biases. And it would have been perfectly appropriate for them to say, for example, oh, poor Holden, he's an anti-corruption activist, but he's also, said some left-wing things. Therefore, we can critique his book as on a book review level, as coming from a particular perspective. So he may have some blind spots. I think that's very different to signing a contract, which specifically says, before you even know what I'm going to write, before you know what's going to be in my book, that you need to develop proactively a series of media narratives to undermine the reporting.
Yeah.
Right. Now, the difficulty with that is, what if the reporting is true? How do you undermine true reporting?
Well, smears and insinuation, which is clearly what happened here. So I think we probably have covered it sort of in a roundabout way, but what specifically were they insinuating about you? And do you think those insinuations and that whispering campaign has in any way affected your career?
I think it has. I mean, it's a bit hard to know.
Let's start actually
exactly
with what they're insinuating. Sorry,
right,
I shouldn't have bundled those two questions. So what they were insinuating, that you were some sort of Russian asset who was getting leaked documents from the Russians, and because of your personal relationship, was sort of networked with left-wing activists who are potentially in a Russian circle.
Which is very funny to me. But I mean, again, the timeline's a bit fuzzy, and we haven't seen everything that was produced internally. What seems very clear is that there's one report that goes to the NCSC, which is the intelligence body within GCHQ, and that says that they suspect that I've received material hacked by Russia, and that I'm connected to other journalists who are part of like they call them Russian hack and leak operations. I really don't know what they're talking about. And the second thing is, they basically say, he's got these family connections, which then raise suspicions, and they say that Andrew Murray, who's Jessica Murray's, my partner's father, is suspected by the MI5 of being connected to Russia, which is not true, because he's had a lobby pass and he's been vetted by security services, right? So that's just a straight lie. He's not suspected by MI5 of being a Russian agent. And then there's this other report now, which we don't know exactly where they got to, who got shown that report, but it's a longer 58-page report, which is the Project Cannon report. And what they say there, I'm told, and again, I've only seen parts of it, is first of all, they dig into my family and then sort of they map my family connections. And second of all, they claim that I have some direct connection to Russian intelligence via South African intelligence, which is, well, they actually say they call it ANC intelligence, which is extremely funny to me and to everybody I know in South Africa.
And this is because the ANC was supported by the Soviet Union for a while, and so they now think that if you're an ANC activist, you've got this.
Well, first of all, I'm not an ANC activist. Right. I've never been an ANC activist. I've investigated multiple sitting ANC presidents for corruption. I've tried to put innumerable ANC MPs behind bars. I've been involved in legal proceedings that have made a lot of ANC members, a lot of ANC MPs and politicians poorer. It seems to be. It's such weird cockamamie nonsense, right? But Andrew Feinstein, who's my colleague, was an ANC MP.
Yeah.
He fled into exile in the 80s, worked to end apartheid. When he came back to South Africa, he was appointed by Nelson Mandela to Parliament. And in Parliament, he realized there was a massive corruption scandal implicating the ANC. And he blew the whistle on that corruption and was effectively forced out of Parliament and then forced out of the country. And for 2 years, me and Andrew couldn't travel back to South Africa on threat of arrest because we've been investigating multiple sitting ANC presidents who weren't particularly happy with what we've been doing. So this idea that we connect to ANC intelligence is mad. Then to connect us to Russian intelligence is even madder because me and Andrew have written and investigated about Russian oligarchs. We've been sued by Russian oligarchs or threatened to be sued by Russian oligarchs. We've had threats from Russian oligarchs. When we were writing A Shadow World, which is the book about the global arms trade me and Andrew did together, we were basically told, we weren't allowed to go east of Poland because something might happen to you, right? So this idea that we can enter ANC and Russian intelligence is totally mad. So the only thing it really relies on is that my partner is Jessica Murray. It's like, so I'm in a relationship with another left-wing person who I might just say, if I may, on record, is extremely beautiful, is very lovely. I love her very much. We have 2 very young daughters who I love dearly, and who herself is a great independent investigative researcher.
I want to look at Josh Simon's response to this. So he responded to the Sunday Times and he said, quote, "I was surprised and shocked to read the report extended beyond the contract by including unnecessary information on Gabriel Pogrund. I asked for this information to be removed before passing the report to GCHQ. No other British journalists were investigated in any document I or Labour together ever received." And so we've read the document he put forward, which, or the document, I suppose the commission he gave to this PI company, basically APCO. APCO or APCO?
APCO. Now I'm getting confused.
No, I feel like you've changed
APCO,
during the interview.
APCO. It's APCO.
APCO, okay, APCO. Right. The commission he gave to APCO, which named you and named Matt Taibbi,
right,
and then also said the Sunday Times report. But I suppose what he's saying here is basically, I wanted to go after Paul Holden and Matt Taibbi.
He's not British. Paul Holden's not British, and Matt Taibbi's American.
But you are British.
Yes.
But also, the message here is quite clear, which is, I thought Paul Holden, he's fair game.
Yeah, he's fair game. He's not a real journalist. He's like a journalist from South Africa, and those people don't count. So, first of all, that's a nonsense response because we've seen the contract. And if you say we're going to find out the motivations and sourcing behind the Sunday Times article, of course, the people who wrote the Sunday Times article are going to be in scope of that contract. That's obviously the case, right? It seems obvious to me, at least on what you could see on the contract, and that's how I interpret it. But then explicitly going after me. Now, I've been living in the UK since 2009. So 17 years now. I've been a British citizen for like 10 years, something like that.
And there's a difference between being a British citizen and a British journalist. It's not that easy to get in this club.
Matt Goodwin said that, it's not a piece of paper doesn't necessarily make you British.
Yeah, exactly.
So maybe I fall into that category in Josh Simon's mind. But basically, I've been a British citizen for 10 years. I'm also a member of the National Union of Journalists, right? And the mad thing about that response is that precisely at the time that APCO has taken out that investigation, look at what I'm doing. One is I'm working with the Sunday Times on the story, and 2, I'm working with the Telegraph on the story. So I'm literally a British journalist working with British newspapers on a story about them. Which is not to say that I'd be fair game if I wasn't British, and obviously it's despicable they went after Matt as well. Matt is like a properly storied journalist, right? He's written incredible stuff. Like, he was probably the preeminent journalist understanding and unpacking like the global financial crisis in 2008. His writing on that stuff is absolutely phenomenal, right? So it just shows, like, on the one hand, a degree of callousness, maybe a degree of like ignorance as well, that he doesn't even realize that maybe it is also a problem to go after non-British journalists who have a bit of a record outside of the country.
I want to take a risk and get you to comment on some intra-elite intrigue.
Oh,
so I'm pretty sure our audience will be convinced that it's outrageous that they went after you. Our audience might not be surprised, though. Sort of like,
sure,
this Labour, that doesn't make it any less outrageous, by the way. Yeah. I'm just saying this sort of shady Labour right-wing organisation goes after left-wing investigative journalists, right? It's outrageous, but it's not surprising. What's more sort of surprising in terms of sort of like gossip and intrigue is that APCO, they hired to write this report, which had 9 pages smearing Gabriel Pogrund. They hired a man called Tom Harper, who's a former journalist at the Sunday Times, so a former colleague of Gabriel Pogrund. He's also married to Caroline Wheeler, the current political editor at the Sunday Times. So this is we often talk about the elite as if they're somewhat coherent. You've got, I mean, this is...
It's ugly stuff.
Yeah,
it's really ugly.
Do you have any thoughts about that? What's going on here?
Well, I mean, the other thing is that Caroline Wheeler and Gabriel Patrick Maguire seem to have like quite a close working relationship.
Well, they're often on a podcast together.
They have a podcast together, yeah. So I'm not sure that podcasting is going to be reconvening in that format anytime soon. I mean, I don't know the inner details there, but I think it's very ugly. And I think Gabriel has a lot of right to be very angry.
Yeah. Just on Gabriel Pogrund, I imagine you probably don't want to go into too much detail, but just because he is an interesting character here, because, you know, he's seems to have collaborated with you in a very sort of effective way, putting this to sort of front and center. He's also sort of in your other work, some of the articles you're very critical of are ones which Labour together fed to Gabriel Pogrund. So the story about Corbyn's hate factory, where they get a few comments from various Facebook groups and then say that means that Corbyn's essentially anti-Semitic. He was he had a byline on them.
It is mad. And I think the best way to understand it is actually quite simple, which is that this is something that Anushka Astana wrote in her book about, because there was a race. Who's going to get the first book out about McSweeney's rise to power or Starmer's rise to power? And she was the one who got there first. And she actually has a very interesting line there. She talks about she's invited to a dinner party with Labour together. I think it's in late 2019, and she says and she goes there with other Guardian journalists, and she writes, so this feels like I'm being inducted into the real leadership campaign here, and she has this line is that Morgan McSweeney understood, and this project understands, there's certain journalists you schmooze, and there's journalists you destroy, right? And it seems like for a period of time, Gabriel Pogrund had like a good working relationship with these people. But as soon as he was doing reporting that was difficult for them, and I should again say, was accurate, was true, was in the public interest, then he's a journalist who has to be destroyed, right? And this is the mad. There's so many messed up angles you can approach the story from, but the long story here, the story in the round, is that this is a political project that's existing in like a very complicated and complex informational space where media is like really dominant in deciding what stories do make certain politicians, what stories make it into the front pages that will affect the trajectory of our national politics. And this is a political project through Morgan McSweeney and Labour together between 2017 and 2020 is very explicit that they will destroy the careers of journalists who writing accurate material in the public interest that is not useful for them. And they do that. They are very successful at doing that. They are, I've had a terrible time with this stuff, and it's been very unpleasant and very upsetting, and it's created a lot of anxiety. But it hasn't, in the end, I've been able to retain my livelihood. There's lots of journalists who didn't. There's lots of journalists who had a good job, sometimes their first job in journalism, and that was destroyed by this political project. And so when journalists come around again in 2023 and 2024 and start asking about this political project, which has already launched a war on journalism back in 2017 to 2020, I mean, it's not surprising to me that then launch another war against accountability in journalism. I mean, that's effectively what I feel they're trying to do with this stuff is to make sure that we don't report on their earlier war on journalism properly. And I just think it shows like a total and utter disdain for like the concept of journalism and the media as a practice. And the concept of like media and journalism that's critical and scrutinizes them as a concept and practice. They're incredibly hostile to that. It seems to be people like Morgan McSweeney and the people around him, really pretty despicable stuff. So it's not surprising to me. In a sense, it might seem mad that, of course, Gabriel Pogrund's sitting in a newsroom and this is happening. But at the same time, he wrote an article that at the time seemed very threatening to this political project. And when this political project is threatened by journalists, what do they do to them? They do this.
Yeah. And I was listening to Gabriel Pochran on the Times podcast this week talking about this story, and he was saying he thinks it probably was quite effective in deterring other papers from picking up the same story, because often once one newspaper breaks a story, everyone else piles in. And he said it was quite conspicuous that after this went on the front page of the Sunday Times, no one else picked it up.
I mean, the Times reported this week that Mandelson was talking about it. I mean, apparently Peter Mandelson was going around basically whispering that their reporting, the Sunday Times reporting, was based on Russian hacks.
Yeah.
Right? Which is basically saying that I was getting material from a Russian hack. I mean, that's the extent to which it's gone. Apparently, cabinet ministers got access to it. And so I suppose one of the problems that I have sitting right now is that I just have no idea at this point who they took this material to, who was told about this stuff. To what extent it shut down investigations. I know, and it's very hard for me to tell because I don't have a baseline comparator, right? Like, when I brought out this book, I didn't expect to get much coverage because left-wing books generally don't get much coverage. But I do think that there has been... I've struggled with the credibility gap, I think, with mainstream journalists. I think there has been... I've often spoken to mainstream journalists and they've been a bit more standoffish than I think that maybe was necessary or based on what I think. If you look at my career, my CV, it actually looks quite centrist compliant, right?
Yeah.
So it's like I don't understand where this wariness comes from. So one of the things we have to basically get to the bottom of now, and I've now submitted a subject access request to Labour Together. I'll do one at APCO, and I basically just need to find out who else saw this stuff. Where did it go to other newsrooms? I mean, I think because I'm not part of a newsroom, I'm part of the same sort of media cycle that Gabriel is. So when Gabriel says, I think this did chill it, like I believe him because I think he's more tied into those networks than I am, and he's hearing more stuff from the ground. So I do think it probably played quite a big role. And nobody did report on that story, right? It's the Sunday Times story, the Telegraph story, which was very hard to get out, I must just tell you, because of what Labour Together were telling the Telegraph behind the scenes. They were saying to the Telegraph, this stuff we think is from a Russian hack, which then meant the Telegraph was suddenly suspicious of me, and I had to explain to them that this is nonsense.
Because you could prove to all of these, I mean, you could prove to all of them it wasn't a Russian hack. Like
Yes,
The Guardian reported today, Paul Holden has shown us his sources, which are just normal internal Labour Party leaks, essentially.
So basically, I took the journalist I was working with, the Telegraph, and I said, well, look, this is where my sourcing's from.
Yeah.
Which is like, oh, yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Let's move on to more recent politics. So Morgan McSweeney, the main character in your book, really, has had his comeuppance. So less than a fortnight ago, he resigned. All of our audience will be very familiar with this story. And that was because of his relationship with Mandelson. Were you surprised about the circumstances of his downfall?
Oh, no, not at all. I mean, I think that so first of all, the pointing Mandelson for me is like the essence of the McSweeney project. I almost feel like it's the perfect expression of it. And I've written about this before, but you know, the appointment of Mandelson comes at like a very specific point in time in history. It's the moment at which Sue Gray, who's the former chief of staff, has been turfed out. She's been subject to this like horrific briefing campaign, which is for some unknown reason decided that she's responsible for the fact that Keir Starmer took freebies before he became prime minister. I never understood how that got stuck on her at all. And Morgan McSweeney becomes chief of staff. He's surrounded by this cabinet that has effectively all of his political allies, and this prime minister who doesn't really know what he's doing there. Morgan McSweeney has this incredible power. And what is one of the first things that he does with this incredible power? It's bring in his old friend Peter Mandelson, who we now know is at least friendly with him between 2017 and 2020, but was actively involved in some of this Labour Party internal factional purging stuff that they were doing as well. He's like Mandelson becomes very integrated into the political project from 2021 onwards. So of course in that moment, they decide, what do they do in this moment of power? It's bringing our old friend Petey, right? Anybody with half a brain knows they're bringing in Peter Mandelson. He's called the Prince of Darkness.
Well, that's what I was going to ask, because do you think in a way they were sort of relishing this? Sort of Josh Simons comes back from America and he's like, you know what, I'm going to hire the private investigators. Because it's quite empowering in a way, isn't it? Because you're doing something secret, you're sort of destroying and making careers. And do you think they feel like, God, this is what power really is?
I don't know if Josh Simons feels like that. I mean, maybe it might actually be if I'm to be like scrupulously fair to Josh Simons, like in a way that I don't actually feel like I want to be, there is something to be said about how APCO really messed him up. Because they didn't tell him who I am and who Matt Taibbi is, and they didn't give him the information he actually needed to deal with this properly, right? They gave him this mad nonsense that I was a Russian spy, right? So I don't know what his motivations are.
Wait a minute. What could he have given him that would have discredited your journalism? What do you mean by that statement?
That's a good question, actually. Well, you know what? Like, I think that their response to my book has been really bad from like a PR perspective, right? Because what have they done? They've first of all, the attack lines they have on me in the media when they've bothered to respond to me have been like really lame. Basically, it's like, don't you know he's basically, he's peddling a far left conspiracy theory. I'm like, oh, fine, I don't care. You can say what you want about me. And the other part of their PR strategy was to report me to the National Security Service, which is now a massive scandal. So it's hardly like this stuff has helped them at all. I mean, how would they? I mean, I don't know how they. To be honest, I'm trying to think.
I was just picking up on you saying they'd done a bad job because.
No, I'm just trying to think of how would I smear myself. I mean, the obvious way to respond to me would be to respond to me on the facts.
Yeah. Can Starmer function without Morgan McSweeney?
No.
So you don't think he's got very long?
No.
I mean, probably one of your least controversial opinions.
No, I don't think he. I mean, the only reason he's staying there is because the McSweeney project was so successful. This is the thing that's like really problematic, right? Is that basically Morgan McSweeney has chosen Keir Starmer, who doesn't have a constituency in the party, doesn't seem to have made that many friends in the party, seems actually quite an isolated and alienated figure. Basically, he subcontracted most of his politics to Morgan McSweeney. All the people in cabinet are Morgan McSweeney's allies. They're not Keir Starmer's allies. And that's part of the problem, is that you basically have all the people that are in cabinet. In a normal situation after Mandelson stuff, you would have had a leadership challenge. But because the McSweeney project has been so successful, you can't have a leadership challenge because the only people who are there in cabinet to launch a leadership challenge are associated with Peter Mandelson or Labour together, right? The only person who's not associated with that stuff is Angela Rayner, who's out of action. So they basically have sitting in this vacuum at this moment where basically they all know that Keir Starmer in normal circumstances would be dead in the water. But because this political project has been so successful in capturing the party and basically denuding it of talent and of making sure that anybody who has minor rapport with the public is excluded, like Andy Burnham, there isn't this natural process of renewal that can happen. Because what should happen in a normal situation, it maybe would have happened 30, 40 years ago in Labour Party history. So Keir Starmer would be deposed, there'd be a new leader, they'd bring in a new broom, they'd look into this dirty stuff and they'd be like, let's deal with it, let's expunge it, let's renew our party. And they can't.
Yeah.
At
So
this point in
you
time.
still think it is Morgan McSweeney's party, even though he's gone?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Morgan McSweeney was personally involved alongside other allies, handpicking the 200 or the 400 MPs who came into the party. Every single member of that cabinet, senior member of that cabinet, has a long-term association with Morgan McSweeney or the Labour Together project, which they've been bragging about since 2023 because they were on the cusp of power, right? They literally said at one stage in 2023, 8 brave MPs came together to restore the party to its election-winning glory, and list all the people who are in the cabinet, right, who are now associated with Labour Together. As they are hiring private investigators to go after Sunday Times journalists, they're also basically bragging about how much influence they have in the cabinet. And this is a crisis. It really is genuinely a crisis. It's a crisis for the Labour Party because they're in this like existential moment where everybody absolutely hates them and they're failing in the polls. But it is genuinely a crisis for our democracy because we currently have like a lame duck prime minister who doesn't really know what he's doing. He doesn't seem to have any sort of intellectual political hinterland to draw on at all. Has no allies around him that he can turn to in this moment of help. The ship of state is listing here and there, and nobody knows what's going to happen. And in that context, the best case scenario is a new political formation that's more progressive, socially liberal emerges. But it's perfectly possible that the beneficiaries of this are the far right. Because this stuff is tailor-made for the far right. It really is. This political scandal is like, from a far-right strategist's perspective, an absolute dream come true.
But their line was already they're all pedos, and now...
So not only they're all pedos who hate journalism, and they also don't like free speech online, right? Like it's like you couldn't wrap up a political scandal for the far right more perfectly than the Labour Together scandal. It is tailor-made for them. And that's a crisis. Like, that really is genuinely a crisis.
Yeah. I mean, the Mandelson thing is the one that's going to damage them the most. But
Yes,
I agree with you on,
Yeah.
on, I mean, really fantastic investigations you've been doing. And, you know, you've withstood this. You've come out stronger.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for speaking to me today on Novara Media.
Thank you.